What are the oldest words humanity ever wrote down weren't meant to begin anything? What if they were more like a final message? A last, desperate record scratched into wet clay by people who knew their world was already ending. In the deserts of southern Iraq, where the heat feels ancient and the silence is heavier than the sand, the ruins of forgotten cities still lie half-buried, under collapsed walls and wind-carved mounds. Tens of thousands of clay fragments are still sleeping. They're small, easy to mistake for broken bricks. But if you pick one up and turn in the light, you see them. Tiny wedge-shaped marks marching across the surface like bird tracks frozen in mud. Those marks are called cuneiform. They're the oldest continuous written records we've ever found. A time capsule human thought reaching back over 5,000 years. And here's the strange part. They don't read like the start of anything. Before we go deeper into that, quick pause. If you like stories where history refuses to sit still and behave, where the evidence doesn't quite match the neat version in the textbooks, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you're listening in the dark somewhere, tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is right now. I love picturing this mystery stretching across time zones while you drift towards sleep or sit up late with headphones on. Back to the clay. The breakthrough with these tablets didn't come with a dramatic "we found it" moment. It started with dust. In the late 1800s, European archaeologists digging around the ancient city of Uruk broke into what looked like nothing more than brick mounds baked solid by thousands of summers. When they cleared the rubble and went deeper, they found something they were not expecting. Rooms. Rooms filled wall to wall with clay tablets, stacked and stored like someone's filing system. Not scattered, not random, deliberately archived. Thousands of them, each about the size of a paperback, each covered edge to edge in that strange wedge script. When linguists finally managed to crack the code and read them, they didn't find what you'd expect from humanity's first writing. No, this is how you make a letter. No, we are inventing civilization. Instead, they were hit with paperwork, tax records, shipping logs, contracts, medical prescriptions, star charts, hymns to gods whose names no one had spoken for 4,000 years. These weren't clumsy first steps into literacy. These were the documents of a civilization already comfortable with thinking and writing. We now call the people who wrote those tablets the Sumerians. And the moment that word entered modern history, something in our timeline started to wobble, because Sumer doesn't slowly emerge out of the dark. It just appears, fully formed, around 3500 BCE, almost overnight in archaeological terms. Cities erupt across southern Mesopotamia, carefully planned streets, monumental temples, sophisticated irrigation systems, long-distance trade reaching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, a mathematical system based on 60, the same base we still use for minutes, seconds, and degrees. Their early cuneiform script already uses hundreds of symbols. Their temples are aligned with precision to celestial events. Their economy depends on complex accounting and standardized measures. This is not how civilization is supposed to show up. The version of history we're used to goes like this. Stone tools, small villages, simple pictures scratched on pots, early symbols, full writing, big cities. Slow, gradual, messy. But Sumer? Sumer walks on stage like an actor who's memorized a whole play before the curtain even goes up. Archaeologists and historians have spent more than a century trying to smooth this out. Some say, we just haven't found the earlier steps yet. The evidence is missing. Erosion and time erased all the trial and error centuries. Others suggest Sumer absorbed knowledge from older, nameless cultures. People wiped out by war, climate, or flood whose ruins we haven't identified. But the Sumerians themselves wrote down a different explanation in their own script on their own clay. One recurring line shows up in their text, and it changes everything. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was an heir due. To them, civilization wasn't invented. It was restored, not a beginning, a reboot. They describe what they're doing not as discovery, but as bringing back what once existed. This is the restoration of what was before. Think about that word, restoration. When you restore something, you're not creating it from scratch. You're patching together fragments. You're repairing damage. You're honoring a memory. From their perspective, the cities, the writing, the laws, the sky charts. None of that was brand new. It was all part of an older pattern they believed had been broken, and they were trying to rebuild it. Imagine this for a second. It's late. You're alone in a museum archive. The public lights off, just those cold, white bulbs humming quietly overhead. You pull on thin cotton gloves and gently lift one clay tablet out of its cushioned tray. It's small, heavier than it looks, cool against your fingers. Up close, the surface is a maze of tiny wedge impressions, each one pressing by a reed stylus held in a hand that turned to dust 5,000 years ago. And if you tilt the tablet just right, you can sometimes see them, faint ridges along the edge. Fingerprints, thumbprints, the literal touch of a Sumerian scribe, preserved like a fossil. That person lived before. The pyramids, the Minoans, Chinese dynasties, Mesoamerican temple cities. They never heard of ancient history. They were living it. And what were they doing? They were writing things like tables tracking the movements of Venus with accuracy we didn't match again until telescopes. Math exercises calculating compound interest. Legal contracts. Medical recipes. Myths about how humans were made from clay mixed with something divine. Again and again, those texts mention a time before the world they knew. A time before the flood. A time when rulers supposedly lived impossibly long lives. A time when those who came from the heavens taught humans how to measure the sky. It's easy to wave all of this away as just mythology, stories. But when versions of that same story show up in Sumerian tablets, later Akkadian and Babylonian texts, the Hebrew Bible, Hindu Vedas, even Mesoamerican codices, you start to get the feeling we're not just dealing with random imagination. We might be hearing echoes of shared memory. In the 1920s, archaeologist Leonard Woolley was digging in the ruins of the Sumerian city of Ur when his team hit something odd, a thick, sterile layer of flood-deposited clay. No artifacts, no trash, just clean silt, a couple of meters deep, sandwiched between two layers of human occupation. The same strange layer shows up at Shurapak, at Kish, at Eridu, multiple cities, the same rough date. It wasn't a global ocean swallowing planet, but it was bad enough that for people living there, it might as well have been the end of the world. The Sumerian texts talk about a great flood, and the ground under their ruined cities backs them up. What makes this uncomfortable is the implication. They weren't just mythologizing, they were remembering. Their tablets divide reality into before and after. Before the flood, long ages, great knowledge, kingship descended from heaven. After flood, rebuilding, restoring, bringing back the decrees from distant days. Every city they raised, every temple they rebuilt, every star they tracked across the night sky, all of it might have been an act of memory, not invention. Remembrance, as if everything they built was their way of saying, this is not the beginning. This is what we managed to save. Let's go back to the clay, because the way memory survives in Sumer is almost hilariously stubborn. Clay tablets don't burn. The wooden shelves they sat on, gone. The mud brick buildings that housed them, collapsed. The cities themselves, buried, eroded, looted, ruined. But the tablets? When a building caught fire in ancient Sumer, the heat didn't destroy them. It baked them. Soft clay hardened into ceramic. Accidental archives created by catastrophe. In other words, every time something tried to erase their writings, it ended up preserving them instead. This is how memory cheats death. Southern Iraq in summer is a brutal place. Temperatures push past 120 degrees Fahrenheit, about 49 degrees Celsius. The air shimmers above the sand. In that heat, the ruins of Uruk still rise from the desert in broken shapes, angles and platforms and half-walls poking through the dust. Once, this was a living city of maybe 80,000 people, crowded streets, temple courtyards, canals glinting in the sunlight. Now it looks like a failed attempt at geometry, swallowed by time. The sand here is constantly on the move. Dunes creep, walls disappear and reappear. And beneath it all, the clay keeps waiting. When archaeologists started digging here in the late 1800s, names like Hormuz Rassam, Ernest de Sarzec, Robert Colway, They weren't hunting for philosophy or science. They wanted statues, treasures, glorious things to ship back to European museums. What they got instead were storerooms filled with paperwork, receipts, inventory lists, contracts, delivery notes. At first, they were disappointed. This wasn't Indiana Jones. It was ancient office clutter. But then the linguist got involved. Once the wedge-shaped script was finally deciphered, the boring tablets turned into something extraordinary. A single tablet from the poor, for example, might look dull at first glance, just lines of cuneiform. But when someone translates it, you realize it's a ration list for temple workers. Barley, oil, will distribute it per person. Right under it, another tablet from the same room. A student's math homework, practicing multiplication tables, including squares and cube roots. Next shelf over, a medical text prescribing remedies for infections, using thyme, cedar resin, fermented barley. On the same table, a hymn to Inanna, a legal document about a boundary dispute between farmers, instructions for predicting lunar eclipses, a farming guide advising when to irrigate based on seasonal flood patterns. This isn't a culture just learning how to write. This is a culture already fluent in administration, law, science, religion, agriculture, and trade. The earliest Sumerian tablets, dating back to around 3500 to 3200 BC, don't show us the awkward baby steps of writing. There's no proto-alphabet that slowly gets refined. From the start, cuneiform is complex. It uses hundreds of signs. Some stand for whole words, others for sounds. It can handle abstract legal ideas, poetic language, precise numbers, astronomical observations. Linguists call this uncomfortable because writing systems are supposed to evolve slowly. Egyptian hieroglyphs, for example, started as little pictures carved into pottery and walls. Simple, literal images. Over centuries, they became more abstract, more flexible. Chinese characters grew from crude symbols scratched on oracle bones. Our alphabet evolved from earlier scripts over thousands of years. They all leave behind layers of evolution, half-formed signs, competing systems, local variants. But with Sumerian cuneiform, we open the curtain, and the script is already mid-performance. No rehearsal in sight. And it's not just the writing, it's what the writing describes. One early tablet from Uruk is basically a land registry. It maps out who owns which plots, how big they are, where the irrigation channels run, which fields border which. To make that tablet, you need geometry, standardized measurements, surveying techniques, administrative structure, and a bureaucracy sophisticated enough to care. All of that is there, right from the earliest layers we've dug up. At Eridu, often considered the oldest Sumerian city, we see the same pattern. Archaeologists expected little shrines slowly growing into big temples over centuries. Instead, even the earliest temple levels, dating back to the Ubaid period, before official Sumer, already show careful layout. A central chamber, side rooms, a raised altar, a clear orientation. By the time we reach the fully Sumerian phase, the temple designs are so advanced that they become the blueprint for later ziggurats, those huge step temple towers. Where did that architectural knowledge come from? The smaller Ubaid villages surrounding Eridu weren't building anything like this. No other signs of monumental architecture. No training wheels. Yet in Eridu, from Layer 1, there's already a clear idea of sacred versus secular space, structural load-bearing, ritual geometry. At Lagash, we see an irrigation system that would make a modern civil engineer raise an eyebrow. The earliest levels already show canals planned with correct gradients, water management that works, no obvious traces of catastrophic failures from bad calculations. You don't get that right on your first try, unless you had help or you were copying instructions. Compare that to early Egypt, where the Nile system took a long time to fully understand. They messed up, they learned, they corrected. In Sumer, it feels like someone started the game halfway through. Same with their math. When cuneiform appears, the base 60 system is just there, No evidence of them trying out base 8, base 10, base 12, and then upgrading. No competing notations. Just, we're using 60. Here's how. And it's not a random choice. 60 is incredibly convenient. Divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30. Perfect for fraction, geometry, astronomy, scheduling. It's such a good system that we still use it for. Minutes in an hour, seconds in a minute, degrees in a circle. But if you look at the Sumerian school tablets used to train young scribes, they don't talk about inventing any of this. In those exercises, you see lines like, "From distant days, the scribal art has been practiced." Not we created it. Not our great king invented this. Just, it was already there. We're continuing it. Their temple hymns say the same thing in a more poetic way. The ancient designs are carried forward from distant days. At Lagash, a boundary stone marking an agreement between rival city-states doesn't boast about drawing a brand new border. Instead, it reads, "The border that was established in distant days is restored again." Again, restored, not created. At Nippur, considered a kind of spiritual capital of Sumer, clay cones buried in temple foundations talk about renovations, bringing back older structures whose original builders had already been forgotten. Over and over, their inscriptions repeat this idea. We are continuing something. We are repairing something. We are not the first ones to walk this path. If this was just one or two examples, you could shrug it off as religious marketing. Look how ancient and sacred our temple is. But this theme shows up everywhere. In religious texts, in legal documents, in royal inscriptions, in educational material. The Sumerians consistently framed themselves not as pioneers, but as custodians, caretakers of knowledge and practices that came from before, from distant days, from a world divided from theirs by disaster. And then there's one particular text that ties all of this together. A document so strange that when it was first translated, scholars weren't sure what to do with it. It's just a list of kings. But it might be the closest thing we have to a receipt from a world that came before. To get there, though, we need to zoom out and look at how civilization normally grows, and why Sumer refuses to play by any of those rules. So let's zoom out, because before we can see how weird Sumer really is, we need to look at how civilization normally grows. Imagine history as a ladder. Most cultures we've studied leave clear rungs. You can climb down from big cities to bigger villages to little farming settlements to people just learning how to plant stuff instead of chasing it. Take ancient Egypt, for example. In the Nile Valley, archaeologists can walk backward in time almost like scrolling down a timeline. Around 3200 BCE. The Naqada III period, you start seeing early hieroglyphs, more elaborate graves, emerging elites. Before that, Naqada II, developing pottery styles, wider trade, signs of social hierarchy. Before that, Naqada I, small farming villages with simple tools. Beneath it all, the Badarian culture, early farmers, basic burials, nothing like pyramids yet. Layer by layer, you watch simple communities slowly turn into a state. Burials get fancier, tools get better, art gets more complex. By the time you hit dynastic Egypt, with pharaohs, pyramids, and hieroglyphs, the climb makes sense. You can see where they came from. Same pattern shows up in the Indus Valley. The big cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, with their grid layouts, drainage systems, standardized bricks, peak around 2500 BCE. But again, they don't just pop out of nowhere. Before that, you have the early Harappan phase, growing towns, more complex crop production. Before that, places like Murgar, a farming village occupied for thousands of years, slowly developing pottery, metallurgy, and long-distance trade. No sudden jumps, just time, experimentation, failure, refinement. Then there's ancient China. By the time the Shang dynasty shows up around 1600 BCE with bronze weapons and oracle bone inscriptions, it's building on the Erlitou culture. Before that, Longshan. Before that, Yangshao. Again, you dig down. You go from cities to town to villages to scattered communities, just figuring out agriculture. Civilization in all these regions is a process, messy, gradual, layered. Now, let's put Sumer back into that picture, because Sumer does something no one was expecting. It skips the messy part. When archaeologists dig into early Sumerian levels, they don't find the architectural equivalent of practice sketches. They find a finished painting. Take Uruk again. In its early major phase, around 3500 BC, it's already covering hundreds of hectares, enclosed with massive defensive walls running for kilometers, organized with districts, residential, industrial, religious, dominated by temple complexes on raised platforms. Those walls alone are insane in terms of logistics. To build them, you need to produce millions of standardized mud bricks, organize huge labor forces, manage food distribution, plan the route and thickness of the wall, keep the whole project running for years. Normally, you only see this level of coordination after centuries of practice on smaller monuments, little temples, short walls, storage buildings. But in Uruk, we step in and the city is already working at mega-project scale. Inside those walls, the layout isn't random either. You've got streets that make sense for drainage and traffic, temples aligned to cardinal directions, specialized areas for pottery, weaving, or metalwork, administrative quarters tied to temple institutions. It doesn't feel like a city growing out of chaos. It feels like someone had a plan. At Eridu, thought to be one of the oldest Sumerian cities, we see a similar story. The earliest temple levels, even before official Sumer, are already laid out with central halls, side rooms, altar spaces, consistent orientation. By later levels, those temples are so well designed that they basically become the prototype for the classic Mesopotamian ziggurat. Again, where are the failures? The collapsed roofs? The weird experimental shapes that didn't work? They should be there, but they're not. Same with Lagash and irrigation. Their canals weren't just ditches in the ground. They were engineered, dug at the right slope so water actually flows, planned to avoid salting the fields, organized to distribute water between districts without constant disaster. We don't see big, obvious mistakes buried under later fixes. It's like someone started them on level 10. Now, let's jump back to writing for a second. When cuneiform appears around 3400 to 3200 BCE, it's not a clumsy experiment. The early version already uses hundreds of symbols, some for words, some for sounds. It's already capable of recording contracts, writing poetry, tracking astronomical data, handling complex legal terms. In Egypt, we can watch hieroglyphs slowly evolve from pictures carved on pottery into a full script. In China, we can see how characters on oracle bones become more stylized over time. With Sumerian cuneiform, the first time it shows up in a big way, it's already multi-purpose, standardized across multiple cities, capable of expressing abstract ideas. And because that's weird, scholars have spent decades looking for its proto-phase. Earlier scratch marks, simplified signs, competing systems. But so far, nothing that convincingly fills that gap. You know how when software is developed, there are alpha versions, beta versions, buggy builds? With Sumerian writing, it's like someone just handed them the final release. The strangeness doesn't stop there. Their earliest legal texts are surprisingly sophisticated. We're not talking simple you stole, you die rules. We see distinctions between intentional and accidental harm, compensation, levels based on social status, formal inheritance rules, laws governing contracts, loans, and debt, legal systems that advance usually grow out of centuries of smaller conflicts, lawsuits, disputes, judgments that expose loopholes. Each new law plugs a gap. But Sumerian law feels like someone sat down and wrote policies already aware of how messy human life gets. Same pattern in their medicine. Early Sumerian medical tablets list ingredients and dosages that actually work. Willow bark, source of salicylic acid, like aspirin, for pain. Specific herbs for infections. Complex mixes for digestive issues. Again, that kind of accuracy doesn't come from flipping a coin. You'd expect earlier phases full of trial and error, terrible combinations, rituals with no effect. Instead, we mostly see recipes that make sense when modern pharmacology looks at them. When you stack all this up, urban planning, writing, irrigation, law, medicine, math, you start to see why archaeologists have a term for this: the Sumerian problem. It's not just that Sumer developed quickly, it's that in our current evidence, it doesn't look like it developed at all between roughly 3500 and 3000 BCE, while other regions are still gently ramping up from villages to towns. Sumerian cities are managing large-scale irrigation, building monumental architecture, maintaining complex legal and religious institutions, teaching advanced math in scribal schools. The usual ladder of progress isn't visible. Sumer just shows up near the top. So, what do we do with that? Scholars have suggested a few possibilities. We're missing the earlier layers. Maybe they're under river silt, or eroded away, or buried beneath modern cities. It's possible. The landscape has shifted a lot. The real development happened somewhere else. Maybe the people who became the Sumerians started in a different region, possibly now underwater along the ancient coastline, and what we see in Southern Rock are their spin-off cities, or the option the Sumerians themselves suggest in their own texts. They didn't invent everything. They inherited it. They say it over and over again. The restoration of what was before. Ancient designs carried forward from distant days. The words of the ancestors must be preserved, not created. Which brings us to one of the strangest documents ever found in a Mesopotamian archive. A text that tries to tell the entire story of kings and cities from the very beginning. One that lists rulers with reigns so absurdly long. Early scholars dismissed it as nonsense, until they realized it might not be nonsense at all, just a different kind of record. This clay prism is now known as the Sumerian King List, and once it enters the picture, the idea of Sumer as a starting point for civilization gets a lot harder to hold on to. Picture this. You're in a museum backroom in the early 1900s. No AC, just dust, oil lamps, and shelves lined with clay. Boxes of tablets from digs in Iraq are stacked everywhere, and most of them look exactly the same to the untrained eye. Little brown bricks covered in tiny wedges. A German scholar named Hermann Hilprecht is doing what has to be one of the most tedious jobs on Earth, cataloging broken chunks of clay from the ancient city of Nippur. And then he notices something weird. One particular object isn't flat like a tablet. It's a prism, a four-sided clay pillar, about the size of a big coffee mug, with writing running down all four faces. When he looks closer, he realizes this isn't a receipt, not a hymn, not a legal contract. It's a list of kings. Line after line, name of a king, the city he ruled from, how long he reigned. Simple format, no drama, no poetic flourishes, just data. Hilprecht had no idea at that moment that he'd stumbled onto one of the most bizarre texts in history, a document that would later be known as the Sumerian King List. Over the next few decades, other copies turned up, fragments at Larsa, versions from Ur, later Babylonian copies, from Nineveh. They weren't identical, but they clearly came from the same tradition, a master timeline of rulers stretching from the beginning of everything up through known historical kings. And that's when people started freaking out, because the king list opens with a sentence that sounds simple until you really think about it. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was an eridu, not after people invented government, not after cities emerged. No, kingship descended from heaven. To the Sumerians, authority wasn't something humans came up with. It was something delivered. And then the list rolls straight into the pre-flood kings. Here's where it gets wild. You get kings like Alulim of Eridu reign, 28,800 years. Alauger, 36,000 years. Others with numbers like 43,200 years. 8 kings, ruling for spans that make modern human lifespans look like a blink. Then kings from other cities. Bad Tibra, Larik, Sippar, Shurapak, each with reigns in the tens of thousands of years. If you take this literally, it's nonsense. Human beings don't live that long. So early scholars shrugged and said, okay, myth, obviously. They decided the first part of the king list was symbolic, a legendary age of god kings, and that the real history started later, once the reign lengths dropped down into only slightly ridiculous territory. But the text doesn't shift styles. It doesn't say, a long time ago, in a mythical age. It presents all of this in the same dry, bureaucratic tone. In Eridu, Alulin became king. He ruled 28,800 years. Alauga ruled 36,000 years. Second Kings, they ruled 64,800 years. No poetry, no moral message, just a spreadsheet in clay. Then comes a single line that acts like a knife through time. The flood swept over. And after that, after the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven a second time, kingship was in Kish. Now the reigns change. Instead of tens of thousands of years, we start seeing numbers that, while still inflated, are at least vaguely human-shaped. People like Edina of Kish, who supposedly ruled 1,500 years. Still crazy, but nowhere near 43,200. Later on, as the list continues, some of the names match rulers we can verify from other inscriptions and archaeology. Kings like Gilgamesh of Uruk show up both in myth and in this list. So scholars split the text in half in their minds. Pre-flood, myth. Post-flood, exaggerated history. Neat, tidy, reassuring. Except, the numbers don't behave like random fantasy. In the 20th century, researchers started noticing something odd about those pre-flood reigns. They weren't just big, they were precise. Over and over, the lengths are exact multiples of a special number in Sumerian math, 3,600. The Sumerians had a term for 3,600. Sar. It's like saying 1,000, but for very large spans of time. Suddenly, 28,800 years equals 8 Sar. 36,000 years equals 10 Sar. 43,200 years equals 12 Sar. These aren't random mythic lifespans. They're clean blocks of cosmic time. It's like someone decided, we're going to encode this in units, and just did the whole pre-flood era in Sar chunks. That's not how you make up fairy tales. That's how you encode cycles. Remember, the Sumerians were serious sky watchers. They tracked the path of Venus in the sky, the cycles of Jupiter and Saturn, solstices and equinoxes, eclipses. They understood that the heavens run on repeat, patterns returning after specific intervals. So one theory began to take shape. What if those absurd reign lengths weren't meant as literal lifespans at all? What if they were astronomical data, disguised as king lists? Now, this guy lived 43,200 years, but this king's era corresponds to 12 great cycles, measured in units that made sense to them. This would flip the whole purpose of the text. Instead of biography, it becomes chronology, a timeline built not on human lives, but on cosmic rhythms. Why encode it this way? Because clay survives. Stories about some cycles and alignments long ago don't. Tie those cycles to name kings and cities, and scribes will keep copying it for religious and political reasons, long after they've forgotten what the numbers originally described. The structure of the list supports this. It treats pre-flood kings in one mathematical style, massive Sar-based reigns, then marks a clean break, the flood, then switches to shorter, more human-scale reigns. Two regimes of time, before the catastrophe and after. What if the king list is exactly what it looks like from their perspective? A salvage document, a way to preserve the idea that leadership and order descended from heaven, meaning from some higher or earlier source. A record of epics measured in cosmic units. A catastrophe that shattered continuity. A second start, kingship lowered again, with a new pattern of rule. To the Sumerians, the flood wasn't just a big storm. It was a line in the sand where the old world ended and the new one began. Scholars originally filed the flood away as myth, until archaeology went into the ground and hit mud. In the 1920s, Leonard Woolley was digging at UR, looking for the city's earliest layers. He expected a gradual thinning of artifacts as he got closer to the beginning. Instead, he found Occupation layers, tools, pottery, fire pits. Then nothing but clean clay. Then below that, another older city with its own artifacts. A literal sandwich of history. Civilization, thick flood silt, earlier civilization. That middle layer wasn't seasonal mud. It was the debris of one massive inundation. Woolley eventually connected this to the flood stories in the Bible and Mesopotamian myths, and called it Noah's flood. It wasn't global, but it was big enough to bury cities across the region the Sumerians called their entire world. And the date? Roughly 2900 BCE. Exactly the point in the king list where the text says, the flood swept over. So now we have a text that divides history into before and after flood. Impossible reign lengths that secretly follow precise mathematical units. Later kings we can verify, and literal flood layers in the ground at the same cities the texts mention. That's a lot of independent arrows pointing in the same direction. The Sumerians didn't treat the flood as metaphor. To them, it was an event, and everything they rebuilt after it, they saw as restoration, picking up pieces, trying to reestablish rhythms, both political and cosmic, that had been interrupted, which leads to a deeper, more unsettling possibility. If the pre-flood numbers encode long-term cycles, and those cycles weren't originated by the Sumerians, then they got them from somewhere, from someone, from a culture that lived through those cycles before the river valleys flooded, and whose knowledge had to be recast as kings and gods just to make it through the centuries. If that's true, then the king list isn't the start of history. It's the index to a world that had already ended. In the next part, we're going to stay with that flood, not just in myth, but in mud. And we'll see how global a memory of a world-ending deluge really is, and why Sumer might be the first civilization to write it down, but definitely not the only one to remember it. Let's go back down into that trench with Leonard Woolley. It's 1929. You're standing at the bottom of a deep, narrow cut in the ground at UR. Above you, layers of broken pottery, fire pits, foundations, proof that people lived here, cooked here, fought, loved, and died here. Then there's a band of nothing. No tools, no houses, no bones, just clean, uniform, dead clay. Below that, you hit artifacts again. Another city, another layer of life. Woolley looks at this and realizes this isn't gradual buildup. This is catastrophe. Something dumped about 8 feet of silt in one go, smothering whatever was there before. And then later on, people came back and built again on top of it. He climbs out of that trench and says to the world, more or less, I think I found evidence of the flood. Headlines love that kind of thing. Archaeologist finds Noah's flood. The reality is a little more careful. The flood Woolley found wasn't global. It didn't climb mountains or drown continents. But in the region the Sumerians knew, the low plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, it absolutely could have felt like the end of the world, because UR wasn't the only place this showed up. At Shuruppak, another Sumerian city, excavations uncovered the same thing. A thick, sterile layer of silt dividing older culture material from newer. At Kish, same pattern. At Eridu, often cited as a first city, there are signs of major inundation followed by rebuilding. It's not everywhere. Some cities were on higher ground and escaped. Others were founded later and carry no scar. But across key locations in southern Mesopotamia, the story in the earth matches the story in clay. There was a flood. It was big enough to erase entire towns. People rebuilt afterward, and they remembered. The Sumerian king list talks about a flood. So does another more famous text, the Epic of Gilgamesh. But even Gilgamesh wasn't first. Long before the biblical story of Noah was written, Mesopotamian scribes were already telling a very similar tale in the Epic of Atrahasis. In that version, the gods are annoyed by humans, too noisy, too numerous. They decide to wipe everyone out with a flood. But one god, Enki, warns a man named Atrahasis, tear down your house, build a boat, load it with seed and life. The flood comes. The boat survives. Afterward, humanity begins again under new terms. Sound familiar? When the book of Genesis later tells the story of Noah, it uses a lot of the same bones. A divine warning, a boat, a flood that lasts for months, a sacrifice after the waters recede, a promise not to wipe everything out like that again. For a long time, people assumed the biblical story was the original and the pagan Mesopotamian ones were distortions or parallels. But the archaeology doesn't agree. The earliest versions of the flood story we found come from Sumerian and Akkadian tablets, centuries older than the Hebrew texts. And many of those Sumerian stories name the hero as Ayusadra, a king of Shuruppak. Shuruppak, the same city where that 2-meter-thick flood layer appears in the ground. Geology and mythology are suddenly on the same page. And it doesn't stop in Mesopotamia. Farther north in Syria, ancient Ugaritic tablets describe the storm god Baal battling Yam, the chaotic sea. Flood imagery is everywhere. Waters threatening to rise and overwhelm the land. Divine forces struggling to hold them back. In India, Hindu texts talk about pralaya, world-ending floods that periodically reset creation. In one story, the god Vishnu appears as a fish and warns Manu about an oncoming deluge. Manu builds a boat, ties it to Vishnu's horn, and rides out the flood. Afterward, he repopulates the earth. Again, warning vessels' survival, rebirth. Jump across the ocean to Mesoamerica, and you find the Maya and Aztec talking about multiple destroyed worlds. In the Aztec Five Suns myth, one world ends in jaguars. One ends in wind. One ends in fire. One ends in a rain that lasts for 52 years, turning people into fish. Only a chosen couple survives to see the next age. Different gods, different symbols, same structure. There was a world. Something catastrophic happened. Most people died. A few didn't. Civilization restarted. You can explain one or two similar stories as coincidence. But when dozens of cultures across the globe tell tales of a world-wiping flood, plus a warned survivor who preserves life and knowledge, at some point, coincidence starts to look more like echo. Scholars have wrestled with that for a long time. One option is, humans just like telling flood stories. Rivers flood, storms happen, people turn that into myth. Fair enough. Another is, different regions had their own big disasters, and each remembered their local catastrophe in their own way. Also possible, there were major floods in Egypt, India, China, and elsewhere. But there's yet another layer to this, the end of the last ice age. Between roughly 12,000 and 10,000 BCE, mammoth amounts of ice melted. Sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, over 300 feet. Entire coastlines vanished. Low-lying land turned into seafloor. Anything built too close to the prehistoric shore? Gone. Maybe we tell ourselves there was no civilization back then. Just hunter-gatherers. No cities. No writing. No large-scale organization. That's the safe version. But what if that's only partly true? If there were cultures living along those coasts, seafaring, fishing, trading, they would have watched their world drown, inch by inch, generation after generation. Imagine living in a place where the bay you fished in as a child is underwater by the time you're old. Your grandchildren's homeland is swallowed by the sea. Your myths have to process the trauma of a world that is literally shrinking. Those people may not have had writing, but they had stories. Stories like, there was a time before the waters rose. We were warned by the gods. We built boats and took what we could. After the Great Flood, we started again. Those stories could travel by mouth for thousands of years, pass from one region to another as people migrated inland, then eventually captured in writing by cultures like the Sumerians, who were the first to have the technology to fossilize memory in clay. So, what does this mean for Sumer? It means that when their tablets talk about a flood, they might be blending two things at once. A regional catastrophe around 2900 BCE, which we can see in the literal dirt at Uar, Shuruppak, and Kish. Much older memories, maybe ancestral, maybe heavily mythologized, of a deeper, earlier drowning from the end of the Ice Age. When the king Lys writes, after the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again, it's not just a dramatic line. It's a worldview. History isn't a straight line to them. It's a cycle. Order arrives. Civilization rises. Catastrophe strikes. The survivors rebuild. Authority descends, again, meaning knowledge, structure, law is restored. From our perspective, Sumer looks like the start. From theirs, they were the reboot. Which brings us back to the uncomfortable question. If something was here before the flood, before 2900 BC, or even before 10,000 BC, how did any of its knowledge survive? You can't expect stone tools or wooden huts to carry advanced astronomy to future generations. You can't expect an oral story alone to preserve exact mathematical systems. Yet in Sumer we see a base 60 math system fully operational, complex laws already in place, medicinal knowledge that works, observational astronomy that seems to have been running for a very long time, no training wheels, no visible learning curve. So maybe the question isn't, how did the Sumerians invent all this so fast? Maybe it's, what did they inherit? And who made sure that inheritance didn't vanish when the waters came? To get closer to that, we have to look at what Sumer did with numbers and knowledge, and how strangely perfect some of their systems were right from the start. If you want to know what time it is right now, you probably glance at a screen or a clock. 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute. If you open a map app and look at coordinates, degrees, minutes, seconds, again, based on 60. If you think about a full circle, 360 degrees. All of that traces back to Sumerian mathematics. They built their number system on base 60. Not 10 like we do, not 20 or 12, 60. And here's the thing. There's no sign they struggled their way to it. We don't see early tablets showing base 8, base 10, base 12, experimental notations gradually abandoned. The earliest math tablets we have are already using 60 like it's just obvious. But 60 isn't random. It's brilliant. 60 can be divided evenly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30. That makes it ridiculously useful for splitting things up fairly, calculating angles, planning construction, doing trade and interest calculations. If you were trying to design a number base that works well for real-world math, you'd have a hard time beating 60. But the Sumerians don't brag about inventing it. In their scribal training texts, the clay school books where students practice their numbers and operations, you don't see inscriptions like, "Here's the new system we created." Instead, you see lines like, "From distant days, the scribal art has been practiced. The tone is clear. This is old. This is inherited. We are keeping it going." Those school tablets are wild if you're imagining primitive ancient math. They contain multiplication tables, division exercises, fractions, problems with compound interest, geometric calculations for field areas. One famous tablet, cataloged as YBC 7289, shows a square with its diagonal drawn in. Next to diagonal is a number written in sexagesimal base 60, notation that, when converted, gives 1.414213. That's the square root of 2, correct to 6 decimal places. We did write square root 2 that precisely again until Greek mathematicians thousands of years later. Yet here it is, on a clay tablet from a student exercise, not even presented like a big revelation, just copied. Someone understood that value. Someone taught it. Generations later, some kid in a scribal school is grinding through his assignment, never imagining that one day people would point his homework and say, "Wait, how did they know that?" The same pattern shows up in their medical texts. We like to imagine ancient medicine as mostly superstition and random herbs, but Sumerian tablets show something else. A tablet from the poor, dated around 2100 BCE, lists remedies like thyme mixtures for respiratory problems, willow bark preparations for pain, yes, the same active ingredient that became aspirin, fermented grain for digestive issues. It doesn't just say, take this plant and hope. It specifies ingredients, preparation methods, dosage, intended effect. When modern pharmacologists look at some of these formulas, they see real, active compounds that do exactly what the tablet says they should. That kind of knowledge doesn't appear overnight. You don't randomly stumble on the right plant, in the right dose, for the right ailment without a long, painful trail of, nope, that didn't work. But in the Sumerian material we have, the record starts after those painful centuries. We see the finished cookbook, not the burned attempts. The same goes for their metallurgy. By around 3000 BCE, Sumerian smiths are producing bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. This is harder than it sounds. Too much tin, brittle metal that snaps. Too little tin, soft metal that bends. The sweet spot is around 88% copper, 12% tin. Sumerian bronze hits that ratio with impressive consistency. To get there, you'd normally expect failed batches, useless tools, broken weapons, experimental smelting sites full of slag and bad metal. Instead, the earliest bronze objects we found from Sumer are already high quality. Properly tempered tools, effective blades, decorative objects with careful casting. Again, it feels like we're arriving mid-story. Their legal codes tell the same tale. The earliest Sumerian laws we've uncovered, predating the famous Code of Hammurabi, are not crude. They distinguish between intentional harm versus accidental harm, different classes of people and different penalties, contract violations, debt defaults, inheritance issues. This isn't if you steal, we chop off your hand. The end. It's more like, if X does Y to Z under these circumstances, compensation is A. But if the same act happens under different circumstances, it's B. Law like this normally evolves case by case. Someone sues someone else. The existing rule doesn't quite apply. A new rule is made. Over centuries, you get a complicated system. With Sumer, the complexity is just there. Then there's their astronomy. If you ever see an image of a clay tablet covered in dots and numbers, you might be looking at something that once lived on the shelf of Sumerian or later Babylonian observatory. One famous set of texts, known as the Venus Tablets of Ammisaduqa, records the appearances and disappearances of Venus over a period of 21 years. The style is dry, almost like log entries. Month X, day Y, Venus rises in the east. Month Z, day W, Venus disappears in the west. You don't get that kind of data set by casually glancing at the sky and occasionally noting, that star looks bright tonight. You get it by watching the sky every day, tracking positions carefully, recording them over decades, comparing your notes with whoever started observing before you were born. And remember, those tablets we have are copies of earlier Sumerian originals, which means the tradition of carefully watching and recording Venus likely stretches even farther back, possibly centuries before. Beyond Venus, they tracked the rise and setting points of the sun across the year, constellations used for timekeeping and navigation, eclipses, to the point of recognizing the Saros cycle, roughly 18 years after which similar eclipses repeat. You don't notice something that's subtle without multi-generational records. Somebody had to write down, hey, an eclipse happened today, copy that for the next generation, and eventually realize these things keep repeating on a schedule. Their major temples, the ziggurats, weren't just fancy religious towers. They were aligned with precision, corners oriented to the cardinal directions, stairways facing specific solar events like solstices, designed as platforms for sky observation. Ziggurats gave you an elevated, stable point to watch the heavens from above the dust and chaos of city life. So, again, we're left with the same nagging pattern. Complex math, working medicine, refined metallurgy, sophisticated law, precision astronomy, all showing up in Sumer's earliest layers, with no obvious trace of the long experimentation that should have led there. If you were to look at all this without any preconceived timeline, you might say, these people didn't start from zero. Someone gave them a head start. The Sumerians themselves say exactly that. Over and over, they write, the decrees were given, wisdom was given, kingship descended from heaven. They don't claim to have invented their own knowledge. They present it as received. And this is where things start to get even stranger, because when we zoom in on their language, the mystery deepens. Every major language we know as family: Latin, Spanish, Italian, French, Romanian, Old Chinese, modern Chinese dialects, Proto-Indo-European, a huge family stretching from India to Ireland. We can watch languages drift, split, evolve. We can reconstruct ancestors by comparing their descendants. But Sumerian? Sumerian stands alone. Linguists call it a language isolate, a language with no known relatives, living or dead. It just appears in a record around 3,300 BC, fully formed, speaking in a structure that looks nothing like the Semitic languages that later surrounded it. And the people who wrote it never once claimed, "We invented this tongue." In their own text, they hint at something else. From distant days, the scribal art has been practiced, as if even their language was an inheritance. If Sumerian is a fossil, a last surviving branch of a language family that vanished, then maybe it's not just their myths and numbers that are preserving a lost world. Maybe the language itself is a relic from before the flood. And that brings us to the next unsettling layer. The Sumerians didn't just write about humanity's creation. They wrote about it like people trying to describe a process, one they didn't fully understand, but were determined to preserve. Most creation myths start with a voice. A god speaks and reality obeys. Let there be light. Let there be sky and earth. Instant results. No mistakes. No prototypes. The Sumerians? They tell a very different story. Their creation myths don't sound like divine magic tricks. They sound almost like lab notes. One of the most important is the Atrahasis epic, written down around 1800 BCE, but based on even older Sumerian material. It doesn't begin with humans. It starts with gods doing manual labor. The younger gods, the Igigi, are digging canals, dredging rivers, maintaining the infrastructure of the world for thousands of years. Eventually, they snap, they burn their tools, surround the house of the chief god Enlil, and basically go on strike. We've had enough. We will not do this work forever. The elder gods panic. They need the work done, but they can't force divine beings into eternal hard labor. So Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, comes up with a plan. Let's create a new kind of worker. Humans, not for worship, not for love, not as a moral experiment, for labor, to dig, carry, maintain, build. But here's where their story goes sideways compared to most mythologies. The creation of humans is not instant, and it doesn't go smoothly. Enki and the birth goddess Nintu, also called Ninmah or Belili, gather clay from the subterranean waters, the Apsu. Then they mix that clay with something else, the blood of a slain god. That divine essence, the texts say, carries Tu, intelligence, understanding, consciousness. In other words, the clay gives a body. The god's blood gives a mind. They place the mixture into the wombs of birth goddesses and wait. 14 beings are shaped, 7 males, 7 females. Already, this doesn't sound like, poof, humans exist. It sounds like, gather materials, combine ingredients, use a biological vessel, wait for the result. A process, not a spell. Another text, the Enki and Ninmah myth, goes even further and describes a failure phase. Ninmah starts creating humans from clay, but it doesn't go smoothly. She makes a being who can't control their bladder. Instead of erasing the attempt or pretending it didn't happen, the story says Enki assigns this person a role where that doesn't matter. Maybe as someone confined to a house, cared for by others. She makes another who can't stand properly. Enki gives him a place among the king's attendants. Another, blind. Another, with paralyzed hands. Each time, the gods don't destroy the defective human. They repurpose them. They adapt the role to the body. On the surface, it's a myth about accepting disability and recognizing value in every person. But structurally, it reads eerily like iteration, attempt, outcome, analysis, adjustment, try again. Ninmah shapes. Enki evaluates. They move forward. This is not how creation is usually described. There's no, and then the perfect human was made in one go. Instead, we tried this. It didn't quite work, so we changed the plan. It sounds less like theology and more like someone trying to preserve the memory of a process they barely understand with the only tools they have, story and symbol. The ingredients are specific. Clay from the earth, essence from a higher being, wombs as incubation vessels, a sequence of attempts before stability. If you strip away the divine names and just look at the structure, you get physical material, something like code or pattern added in. Biological development, trial and error. No, this is not modern genetics. The Sumerians had no concept of DNA, but if people in a pre-scientific age had somehow inherited knowledge, or at least stories, about a deliberate process behind human origins, this is exactly how it might look once translated into myth. The wise ones mixed earth and essence. They made many attempts. At first, the results were flawed. Then, eventually, something stable emerged. We read it now as the gods created man. But the text itself doesn't say. He spoke and they appeared. It walks you through steps. And notice something else. Humans in these stories are not an accident. They're not an afterthought. They're a solution. The gods need workers. They design a being to fill that role. That implies intent, planning, purpose. And once humans are made, they don't start as wild creatures in the forest. They begin in a context of organized labor, digging canals, maintaining temples, feeding the gods through offerings. Only later do the myths layer in themes of worship, morality, rebellion. Underneath it all is this unsettling core. We were made because someone needed us to work. Now ask yourself this. If you're a scribe in 2000 BCE, preserving traditions that might already be over 1,000 years old, how do you write down something your ancestors whispered in more clinical terms? You don't have words for genetic engineering or selective breeding or bioengineering or modification of existing hominids. All you have are clay, blood, wombs, gods. So you use the vocabulary you have. The gods mixed earth and divine essence. They made mistakes. They corrected them. We're not used to reading myth this way. We're trained to see these stories as fantasy, morality plays, spiritual allegories. But Sumerian myths are often oddly procedural. They give steps, recipes, sequences. Their creation account doesn't feel like someone trying to explain why life exists. It feels like someone trying not to forget how it started, according to memories passed down from distant days. Whether those memories are literally accurate or not is one question, but it's hard to ignore this pattern. They talk about knowledge being given. They describe creation as a process. They see themselves as restorers, not originators, which brings us to the beings they consistently name as the givers of that knowledge. The ones they say taught them everything from farming to writing to temple architecture. The Sumerians had a word for them, Anunnaki, and in the next part, we'll look at who those beings were supposed to be, who they reminded other cultures of, and why their role in Sumerian memory might be less gods in the sky and more survivors from a world that ended, trying to pass on what they knew before it was lost forever. If you spent any time in the weirder corners of the internet, you've probably heard the word Anunnaki tossed around like a conspiracy catchphrase. But in the clay, in the actual Sumerian texts, they're not me material. They're something much stranger and much more grounded. In one cylinder seal from around 2600 BCE, 7 figures sit on thrones. They're robed, bearded, each holding a different symbol of authority. Above them, a short line of cuneiform identifies them. The Anunnaki, the great gods who decree fate. They show up everywhere. In temple hymns, in legal oaths, in creation myths, in descriptions of how cities were founded, how laws were given, how knowledge arrived. They're not vague spirits. They're not distant, unknowable cosmic forces. They have names, family trees, rivalries, specific jobs, and their job description, over and over again, comes down to this. They set things in order. The word itself breaks down as Anunnaki, usually understood as offspring of Anu, the sky god. They're like the executive council of the cosmos, not the ultimate source of existence, but the tier that actually gets things done. Enki, wisdom, freshwater, crafts, problem solving. Enlil, air, wind, agriculture, authority. Inanna, love, war, Venus, kingship. Utu, the sun, justice, law. Ninursag, the earth, birth, fertility. If you strip away the myths and just look at their portfolios, they're weirdly practical. One hymn says of Enki, he placed in order the rites, the brick mold, the kiln, the pickaxe, and the basket. He laid the foundations for settlements. That's not abstract spirituality. That's how to make bricks, how to organize construction, how to build towns. Another text says Enlil brought forth the seed of the land, organizing plowing and sowing, setting up cattle pens and sheepfolds. These gods are being credited with teaching farming, teaching animal husbandry, teaching irrigation and city building. They're not floating in the sky doing nothing. They're portrayed as on-site instructors. But here's what makes the Anunnaki so unnerving if you read their stories closely. They're powerful, but not invincible. Knowledgeable, but not infallible. They get tired, make bad decisions, argue with each other, hold councils and vote, have regrets. In the flood stories, some of them push for wiping out humanity. Others secretly help a human survivor. After the waters recede, the text described them weeping over destruction, shocked at the scale of what they caused. That's not how you write about omniscient, flawless deities. That's how you write about people. Just people written at mythic scale. For that reason, some scholars have suggested a controversial possibility. The Anunnaki might have started as real individuals, powerful rulers or elite survivors from an earlier age, whose memory was preserved and gradually mythologized. We know other cultures did this. In Egypt, the Nedru are called gods, but temple inscriptions also talk about them walking among humans in pre-dynastic times, establishing law and architecture. In China, legendary sage kings like Fuxi and Shennong are portrayed as culture bringers, inventing writing, medicine, agriculture. They're almost human, almost more. In Greece, the Titans and some of the Olympians act a lot like powerful ancestors retrofitted into cosmic roles. In Mesoamerica, figures like Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha show up as wandering teachers who arrive after catastrophe to restart civilization, then vanish. Over and over, we see the same pattern. A group of unusual figures arrive from elsewhere. They teach things normal people don't know yet. Farming, astronomy, architecture, law. They eventually disappear. Their students, or the descendants of their students, elevate them into the realm of the divine. Is that what happened in Sumer? We'll never know for sure. But the way the Sumerians talk about the Anunnaki fits this pattern unsettlingly well. They say, kingship descended from heaven. The decrees of civilization were laid down. The wording suggests transfer, not invention, like something was handed over. And it wasn't just Sumer telling this story. In Egypt, the gods are called Nedru, beings who arrived in the deep past and established Ma'at, the cosmic order. The texts say they ruled in person before the human pharaohs. Their temples align with stars and solstices with the same kind of precision we saw in Sumerian ziggurats. In India, the Devas appear in myths as luminous beings connected with the sky, who intervene at the turning points of cycles. They don't just exist in some far-off heaven. They come down, instruct sages, re-establish Dharma when chaos takes over. In early Jewish and Christian literature outside the main Bible, like the Book of Enoch, you get the story of the Watchers, angels who descend to earth, intermarry with human women, and teach humanity things they weren't supposed to know: metalworking, cosmetics, enchantments, astrology. In other words, technology and advanced knowledge. The texts are critical. These Watchers are framed as corruptors, but the structure is the same. Beings from above taught us things we didn't know. Civilization accelerated, and it came at a cost. You can write all that off as coincidence or archetypal storytelling, or you can sit with how specific some of these parallels are. Because Sumer's Anunnaki come from the sky God Anu, live in mountain houses and temples that connect heaven and earth. Teach humanity agriculture, writing, kingship, architecture. Walk among humans in the earliest stories. Gradually withdraw as time goes on. Egypt's Nedru, same. Mesoamerica's sky serpents, same. India's Devas, similar idea. The Watchers, same spine, different spin. Different clothing, different names, same backbone. That suggests one of two big picture possibilities. Every culture independently made up very similar teacher beings, because humans are wired that way. They're all remembering something, distorted through time and belief, but anchored to a core event or pattern. If we lean into that second option for a moment, the question becomes, remembering what? The Sumerians themselves give a pretty blunt answer. The world before the flood. To them, the Anunnaki are the link between a lost age and their own. They're the ones who knew how things worked in the first days, survived the catastrophe, carried knowledge across the break in continuity, helped rebuild, even if only through mythic memory later. Think about the position Sumer is in. On one side, a physical geological scar, a flood layer literally under their feet in cities like Shurapak and Uar. On the other side, stories of rulers with absurdly long reigns, cycles measured in thousands of years, knowledge of the heavens that seems to stretch farther back than their own history. In the middle, them, the restorers, the ones saying, we are rebuilding what was before. If you grow up in that world, what do you do with the last fragments of testimony from people who lived before everything washed away? You deify them. You turn them into the Anunnaki. You fold their names into your rituals. You attach them to your temples and your cities. You say, this god founded the city. This god gave us these laws. Because you no longer remember the people behind the knowledge. You just remember the knowledge came from somewhere higher, older, other. So when we hear Anunnaki now, we're not just listening to wild theories about aliens or fantasy gods. We might be hearing the very last echo of a pre-flood leadership class, or a group of unusually advanced survivors, or, at minimum, a cultural memory that says, we did not start from scratch. Someone showed us how. Layer that onto everything else we've seen. The sudden arrival of Sumerian sophistication, their obsession with restoration, over invention, their precise but unexplained mathematics and astronomy. Their isolate language with no clear parent. Their procedural, almost technical creation myths. Their detailed flood stories anchored in real mud. At some point, the Sumerians stop looking like the dawn of civilization and start looking like what they always claimed to be: the archive, the recovery team, the scribes of a story that began long before their cities existed. Which brings us to the hardest question of all, the one that quietly sits behind every wedge mark in that clay. If Sumer wasn't the beginning, where was the beginning? And did the Sumerians accidentally leave us a map, written not in coordinates, but in something even harder to erase? Numbers, cycles, star patterns, and a language that refuses to connect to anything we know? In the next part, we're going to pull all of those threads together and stand in that climate-controlled archive again, holding one clay tablet in our imagination, because the fingerprints pressed into that tablet might not just be the mark of a single scribe. They might be the last living touch of a whole world trying to say, this is not the beginning. This is what we managed to save. So let's go back to that room. Not a temple this time. Not a ziggurat under open sky. But a modern archive. White walls, humming vents, climate control set just low enough that the clay stays cool. Somewhere on a padded tray, a single Sumerian tablet rests in a custom foam cradle. If you were allowed to touch it, and you won't be, but imagine you could, you'd feel how small it really is. Not huge or monumental, just a palm-sized rectangle of baked mud, rough at the edges. Turn it a little, and the light catches the surface. Hundreds of tiny wedge marks, each one pressed into soft clay by a reed stylus 5,000 years ago. Lines of script, so dense they almost look like machine code. And if you look closely at the edge, there they are, fingerprints. The thumbprint of a scribe who lived, before the pyramids of Giza were finished, before the great cities of the Indus Valley reached their peak, before any alphabet existed anywhere. That thumb pressed into clay believing one thing: what I'm writing matters. We spent this whole story chasing what might have mattered to that scribe. Because when you stack all the threads we've followed so far, a strange picture starts to form around that little tablet. Think about what we've seen. A civilization, Sumer, that appears in the archaeological record already fluent. From its earliest attested phase it has. Fully functional cities with defensive walls, zoning, and temple complexes. Advanced base. 60 mathematics that still shapes how we measure time and space. Tablets calculating the square root of 2 with insane precision. Medical recipes that actually work under modern analysis. Bronze alloys hitting optimal ratios from the jump. Irrigation networks and administrative systems running at regional scale. A legal framework that understands nuance, intent, compensation, and class. There is no visible baby phase, where they're fumbling around with crude symbols and random policies. Sumer doesn't start at stone tools and learn up. It walks on stage already in costume, hitting its lines. Then we have the Sumerian king list, a text that claims kingship descended from heaven, rulers before the flood with reigns spanning tens of thousands of years. Numbers that secretly line up as precise multiples of a special time unit. The Sar, 3,600, a dividing line. Then the flood swept over. After that, more realistic lifespans and kings we can independently verify. At first glance, it's nonsense. Look again, and it starts to look less like biography and more like an ancient time-keeping system. Cosmic cycles compressed into reigns to survive in cultural memory. Then there's the mud itself. Excavations at UR, Shurapak, Kish, Eridu all show. Normal settlement layers. A thick sterile band of flood silt. Older settlement layers beneath. A literal before and after, with a watery scar between. Dated to roughly the same era the king list marks as the time when the flood swept over. On top of that, we got flood stories echoing from Mesopotamia, the Bible, India, Mesoamerica, the Mediterranean, all describing a world-ending deluge, a warning to one or a few, a vessel, survival, rebuilding civilization afterward. You can hand-wave one or two of those as coincidence. You can't easily hand-wave a planet's worth. Add to that Sumerian as a language isolate, a tongue with no known relatives, no clear evolutionary trail, that just appears in written for around 3,300 BC as if someone hit unmute on a conversation that had been going on offstage. Linguists look at Sumerian and see a structure that doesn't match neighboring Semitic languages, a grammar built like a glutinative system, more like Turkish or Japanese than anything in ancient Mesopotamia. Hints of a substrate, ghost traces of an even older language beneath it, like an accent inherited from someone who's no longer there. If Sumerian is the last surviving child of a drowned language family, then the flood didn't just erase cities, it erased speech. What we're reading on those tablets might be one of the only voices left from a population that existed before the waters came. Then we hit the creation myths. Not a god said a word and we appeared, but gods mixing clay and essence, placing that mixture in wombs, producing multiple failed prototypes, each flawed being given a role, refinement over attempts until something stable emerges. That's bizarrely procedural. It reads like somebody tried to describe a process they didn't fully understand, using mythic language to encode. There was a deliberate making. There were steps. There were mistakes. It took time. Finally, hovering over everything, there are the Anunnaki, not vague cosmic fog, but named figures with jobs. Teaching irrigation, laying foundations, ordering laws, interacting directly with humans in the earliest stories, linked explicitly to the first days before the flood, then gradually receding into myth as time goes on. When you zoom way out and look at the whole board, Sumer stops behaving like the origin of civilization. It behaves like a reboot, a civilization that arrives full form because it's not starting from zero. It's picking up a thread that was already ancient when the first Sumerian city was built. And that's not just a modern theory. That's how they themselves talked about it. Over and over, their inscriptions use the same phrases. The restoration of what was before. Ancient designs carried forward from distant days. The words of the ancestors must be preserved, not created. They saw themselves not as inventors standing at the start of history, but as custodians, trying not to drop what had been handed to them. If that's true, even partly true, it flips our timeline inside out. We like to imagine, first, there were primitive nomads, then farming, then cities, then writing, then us. Clean, linear, upward. But Sumer's clay whispers a darker, more complicated version. Once, there was a world that already knew the sky. It already understood cycles, farming, maybe even engineering at a level we'd call surprising for its age. Something happened, flood, climate shift, Whatever combination of disasters you prefer, that world ended. A few fragments survived: knowledge, rituals, star charts, words. People like the Sumerians spent their civilization not inventing from scratch, but salvaging. If that's the case, then we are at the cutting edge of some perfect arc of progress. We might be standing toward the late chapters of a very old story, rebuilding on ruins we no longer recognize as ruins. But here's the maddening part. The Sumerians didn't write. Here's the whole truth about what came before. They wrote, "This is what we remember." They left us clues in numbers, mythic narratives, city layouts, language, ritual formulas. Not because they were trying to impress future archaeologists, but because they were trying not to lose what little they still had. So now we're left staring at their legacy and asking a question they would probably find very familiar. If this isn't the beginning, where does the story actually start? And are we willing to take seriously the possibility that what we've been dismissing as myth might actually be the only surviving record of that lost opening chapter? In the next part, we'll lean into that question. We'll look at what it means if Sumer was a restoration project, not a startup, and what that does to our idea of progress, memory, and our place in a history that might be much older and much stranger than we've let ourselves imagine. If Sumer wasn't the starting line, if everything we followed so far points to them standing in the wreckage of someone else's ending, then the story we tell ourselves about human progress isn't just a little off. It's upside down. We like straight lines. You see it in every timeline graphic. Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Classical, Medieval, Industrial, Digital. An arrow, always pointing up, always moving forward. But Sumer's own testimony doesn't fit that narrative. Their texts don't say, "We discovered writing. We invented mathematics. We created cities." They say, "We restored what had been before. We preserved the words of the ancestors. Kingship descended again." To them, history moves in loops. Order arrives from a higher source. Civilization flourishes. Catastrophe strikes. A few survive. Those survivors carry fragments into the next cycle. Someone like the Sumerians tries to rebuild. From that angle, the flood wasn't just a bad storm. It was a reset. And Sumer was the first big attempt to sync back up with whatever rhythm existed before. That would explain why their knowledge feels half remembered and half miraculous. They know how to use base 60 mathematics, but not where it ultimately came from. They can calculate square root 2 with wild accuracy, but never claim to have invented the method. They track Venus like seasoned astronomers, but their myths talk about wisdom being given, not painstakingly derived. Their laws feel like the product of centuries of case law, but the earliest codes we have already start complicated. They behave like a people working from inherited blueprints. Imagine you're born into a world where your grandparents tell stories about cities now underwater. Your priests recite rituals older than your language. Your sky watchers use star patterns nobody remembers the origin of. Your craftspeople know how to make bronze, but not who first figured out the mix. You wouldn't feel like a pioneer. You'd feel like a caretaker. That's exactly how the Sumerians talk. And that's why they obsessed over preservation. Training scribes for years to copy older texts without changing a wedge. Burying foundation deposits with descriptions of how a temple was rebuilt, so future generations could restore it again. Writing on clay. Heavy, awkward, but almost indestructible when fired by disaster. Fire that should have destroyed their archives ended up baking them. Floods that collapsed their buildings left tablets buried, not erased. Accidents of destruction became acts of preservation. The irony is brutal. The original purposes of many of those tablets, tax records, temple receipts, bureaucratic lists, are long dead, but the knowledge embedded around them, the worldview between the lines, that survived. And what it says over and over is, there was a before, we are the after. We did not start this story. So what does that do to us? Because we like believing we're the turning point, the singular moment where a clever species finally cracked the code. We tell ourselves, we started in caves, we built tools, we slowly climbed out of ignorance. Now we're here. But what if this isn't the first climb? What if we're more like someone remodeling an old house, assuming we built the foundation, because we never thought to check what was already buried in the walls? What if the story looks more like this? A civilization rises to a level that seems advanced for its time. It hits a wall. Environmental, astronomical, self-inflicted, or some mix. It falls. A few people manage to carry forward language, rituals, and the most critical knowledge. Thousands of years later, their descendants mistake hand-me-down wisdom for brand-new genius. We'd still be impressive. We've done astonishing things. But we wouldn't be first. And that's the part that unsettles us. Because if humanity has built something great before and lost it, that means we're not just capable of progress. We're capable of forgetting on a civilizational scale. Think about Sumer again. By their own time, they'd already lost track of the true meaning behind the pre-flood numbers, the real identities behind the Anunnaki. The original language, their own tongue, seemed to be built over. They could feel the weight of distant days in their rituals and myths. But if you'd ask a Sumerian scribe, okay, but when did all this really start? They probably would have pointed back to stories they themselves only partially understood. We're in the same position now. We dig their tablets out of the ground, squint at the wedges, and say, clearly these are myths. Then we build timelines like we're sure of everything that happened before 5,000 years ago based on a tiny fraction of what's actually survived. Here's the uncomfortable reality. Most of human history has no written record. We're trying to reconstruct tens of thousands of years of potential complexity from a few stone tools, bones, scattered ruins, and the last 5 millennia of texts written by people who already knew they were living in someone else's shadow. The Sumerians are the first voices we can read clearly, but they're not speaking as founders. They're speaking as witnesses of memory, like someone waking up after disaster and writing. We're trying to put things back the way they were. Here's what we remember. Here's what we were told. Here's what the old stories say. If that's what these tablets really are, then maybe we've been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of, did they really mean that kings ruled for 30,000 years? We should be asking, what were they so desperate not to forget that they encoded it in math and myth and king lists and star charts? Instead of, are the Anunnaki actual gods or just characters? We should be asking, whose fingerprints are still faintly visible behind the stories of these beings who gave knowledge? Instead of, is the flood myth true or false? Maybe, what real events were so traumatic that they survived across continents in the one medium that can cross millennia? Story? We're standing in the same position now that the Sumerian scribes were in, surrounded by inherited knowledge we didn't personally create. Physics, code, planetary data, historical archives. We assume the continuity will always be there. But Sumer's clay quietly argues the opposite. Continuity is fragile. Memory is fragile. Civilizations can forget more than they remember. That's the real horror between the lines. Not that there might have been a sophisticated culture before Sumer, but that entire cultures can vanish so thoroughly that all that's left of them is a number base, a handful of myths, some star alignments, a strange orphan language with no family. And even those scraps almost didn't make it. If a few walls hadn't burned just right, if a few temples hadn't collapsed in the right way, if looters had smashed instead of stolen, we might never have heard a word from Sumer. We'd be even more certain that we are the beginning. We'd be even more wrong. So maybe those little clay rectangles aren't just records. Maybe they're warnings. Not in the sense of another flood is coming, but in the sense of don't flatter yourselves. You're not the first to know things, and you're not immune to losing them. In the next part, we'll step all the way back from the trenches and the tablets and ask, if Sumer really was trying to tell us, this is what we managed to save, what does that mean for us, standing thousands of years later with their word in our hands? And what might we do differently if we treated their so-called myths not as fantasy, but as a last, stubbornly surviving chapter of someone else's reality? Picture this. Thousands of years from now, our cities are gone. Glass and steel don't age well. Concrete crumbles. Plastics break down. Hard drives become just rocks with attitude. The people living in that far future dig into a collapsed building somewhere that used to be a server farm or a library. And maybe they find one thing they can still read. A children's encyclopedia. A half-burned physics textbook. A printed star chart. They'd try to reconstruct what we were like based on scraps. They'd probably get some things horribly wrong. They might think we worship math because we wrote it so carefully. They might think we invented certain ideas when really we were already late to the party. That's us with Sumer. We're interpreting an entire lost world through a fraction of their tablets, a handful of ruins, and myths we've been told are just stories. And yet, even through that tiny keyhole, something pretty huge is coming through. Not a detailed blueprint of the past. That's gone. But a mood, a posture, a message. The Sumerians don't act like people standing at the ground floor of history. They act like people standing in a burned-out archive, sweeping ash off the floor, picking up whatever documents survived and saying, okay, let's try to rebuild from this. That shift in perspective changes the way we read almost everything they left. Their base 60 system, astronomy, legal frameworks, flood stories, creation myths, Anunnaki legends stop being evidence of civilization springing from nowhere. They start to look like recovered fragments, not fully understood, not fully intact, but too important to abandon, which brings us to us. Because there's a strange symmetry here. The Sumerians were worried about forgetting the world before them. Were worried about explaining the world before them away. They said, knowledge was given. We are restoring. We say, they were naive. They were myth-making. They encoded their memory in clay. We translated it into English and then shrugged. But what if, just for a moment, we take them seriously on their own terms? What a given doesn't have to mean aliens, or literal gods descending in UFOs, or anything that dramatic. What if given just means? We don't know where this came from. It arrived in our hands, already complete. That happens to us all the time. You didn't personally invent calculus, musical scales, electricity, binary code, orbital mechanics. You inherited them. They were given to you by people you'll never meet. Now imagine someone 5,000 years from now finds one of our textbooks with your handwritten notes in the margins. They might assume you discovered the formulas yourself. You didn't. You were copying. What if that's what we're looking at in Sumer? Not the first inventors, but the first copiers who had access to sturdy enough material that their version of the story couldn't be entirely erased. From that angle, their myths become translation devices. Imagine trying to describe nuclear physics to a Stone Age hunter, using only the concepts he knows. You'd end up saying things like, there's fire hidden inside stone. When you release it, the world burns like 1,000 suns. Technically wrong in every way. Emotionally and structurally, not that far off. The Sumerians might have been in the same position, holding on to inherited tales of deliberate creation, cosmic cycles, catastrophic floods, teacher beings. Try to encode those in a framework that made sense to them. Gods, essences, kingship descending from heaven. When they talk about kings ruling for 30,000 years, knowledge being given, humans shaped from earth and divine essence, the Anunnaki bringing the tools of civilization. They might not be lying. They might be struggling to preserve something they received through many layers of retelling. Is it literal? Maybe not. Is it meaningless? Definitely not. And this is where it loops back to us in a way that feels uncomfortably relevant. Because we're also living in a time of overwhelming knowledge and rising risk. We have a planetary scale technological system we barely understand as a whole. Climate shifts unfolding faster than our institutions can adapt. Tools powerful enough to change the biosphere and the human mind. An attention economy that rewards distraction over reflection. The Sumerians' flood stories aren't just about water. They're about hubris, about a world that grew so loud, so chaotic, so out of balance that even the beings in charge couldn't keep it together. The gods and Atrahasis don't wipe everything out of pure malice. They do it because they've lost control. Then they regret it. The message lurking behind that might be careful what you build. You may not be able to manage the consequences. And if it collapses, the people who come after you will have no idea what they lost. Sound familiar? If civilization is cyclical, if it rises, specializes, overshoots, collapses, and then gets partially rebooted by survivors, then we're not the final product of human history. We're one version. In that light, Sumer's obsession with preservation stops feeling quaint and starts feeling urgent. They didn't know who would come after them. They just knew someone might. So they carved into stone, pressed into clay, buried messages in temple foundations, trained scribes to copy texts over and over. Long after anyone fully understood their origin, they acted as if saving knowledge mattered more than being right about every detail. Meanwhile, we keep most of our memory on servers powered by fragile systems, inside a civilization that assumes. We're too advanced to fall that far. The Sumerians probably thought that too. No one builds cities and ziggurats and star-tracking temples, expecting them to become anonymous mounds of dirt. And yet, here we are, standing in museums, squinting at their broken pieces, trying to reconstruct what happened. Maybe the most sobering lesson hiding in their tablets isn't. There was a civilization before us. Maybe it's... Advanced doesn't mean permanent. They were advanced for their time. We're advanced for ours. The planet doesn't care. Floods still come. Skies still change. Systems still break when stressed hard enough. So what do we do with that? We could ignore it. Say, cool story, old clay. Anyway, back to scrolling. Or we could take a page from their playbook and ask, what would we want someone 5,000 years from now to know about us? How can we store that in ways that might actually survive catastrophe? Which parts of our knowledge are so important that losing them would be like turning the lights off on the species? The Sumerians thought things like star cycles, flood memories, stories of creation, and the idea that knowledge was given and could be lost again were worth carving into stubborn material. We might choose things like physics, biology, medicine, ethics hard-won from history, the story of what we did right, and what we did disastrously wrong. Because at some point, whether in a century or 10,000 years, somebody may be standing in their own version of a dusty trench, holding a piece of our world, wondering, were we the first, or were we just the ones who managed to save something? In the final part, we'll push the last question the Sumerian tablets quietly ask us. If they were archivists of a lost world, and we're now the archivists of theirs, what happens if we stop treating their words as myth and start treating them as exactly what those ancient fingerprints suggest? A message, not from gods, from people who knew what it felt like to live at the end of someone else's beginning. So let's stand in both places at once. In the desert of southern Iraq, where the ruins of Ur, Eridu, and Uruk lie baking under the sun, and in that silent museum archive, where clay tablets sleep under fluorescent light, dust and climate control, sandstorms and security glass. Two ends of the same thread. Out there in the ruins, sand moves over broken walls and fallen bricks. Once, those walls held noise, market shouting, livestock, children, priests chanting under starry skies. Now it's just wind. In here inside the archive, the noise is gone too. The scribes are gone. The cities that commissioned these tablets are long dead, but the clay is still speaking. We spent this journey listening to it, piece by piece. Sumer appears fully formed where there should have been centuries of trial and error. Their own texts insist over and over, this is the restoration of what was before. They record reigns so impossibly long they only make sense as encoded cycles, not lifespans. Their flood myths line up with actual layers of flood silt in the earth. Their math, law, medicine, and astronomy behave like inherited systems, not fresh inventions. Their language floats alone and isolate with no family tree. Like the last speaker of a tongue whose people were washed away, their creation myths read less like, and then magic happened, and more like, here's the process as we remember it. Their gods, the Anunnaki, act less like untouchable beings and more like half-remembered teachers from a world that ended. Step back, and the pattern that emerges is simple and unnerving. The Sumerians never claimed to be the beginning. We decided they were. Because it's comforting to have a neat starting line. It makes us feel like we're holding the complete script, not just the last few pages. But what if those wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay are telling us something else? What are they saying? We were standing where you're standing now, on the far side of catastrophe, trying to salvage whatever we could from a story already in ruins. We don't know who came before Sumer. We don't know what they built, what they understood, how far they got. Most of their traces, if they existed at all, would be long gone. Coastlines swallowed by postless age seas. Wooden structures rotted out. Oral traditions splintered and absorbed into younger cultures. What we do have is this: a civilization that sprang up seemingly too quickly, with too much already in place and kept insisting in its own handwriting. We didn't start this. We're remembering. It doesn't prove a lost super civilization. It doesn't require aliens or anything outside the human story. But it does suggest something we're not always ready to hear. Humanity might have a longer memory than we think, just not written in ink or stone. Written in myth, in number systems, in the choice of which stories get told again and again. Sumer might be the first place the human species managed to slam that memory into a medium disaster couldn't easily erase. Not because they were more advanced than everyone else, but because they had clay, and fire, and a deep fear of forgetting. Look at the fingerprints again on that tablet edge. That scribe didn't know you'd ever exist. They weren't writing for you personally, but they were writing for someone. Someone beyond their own lifetime. Someone beyond their own city, their own era. Someone they hoped would still be able to read what they were desperate to preserve. In that sense, the Sumerians were doing for us what they believed others had done for them. They felt the weight of distant days behind them, days when, according to their stories, humans were fashioned from clay and divine essence. Knowledge was handed down, not slowly assembled. The world was unified before language fractured and waters rose. They couldn't reach back and see those days clearly, but they could reach forward. So they did the one thing human beings do when we're terrified of losing something important. We tell stories about floods, about gods who teach, about kings whose reigns last as long as the stars, about a time when everything made more sense than it does now. We call that mythology. They called it memory. Maybe the difference is just how seriously we're willing to take them. Because myths aren't instruction manuals. They're not blueprints. They're not clean data. They're more like dreams cultures have about their own past. Distorted, symbolic, but rooted in something that once felt real. If you strip away the obvious embellishments, Sumer's dream keeps circling the same core. There was an age before ours. Something terrible happened. A few survived. They passed down fragments. We rebuilt from those fragments. That doesn't have to mean skyscrapers underwater or forgotten spaceports. It can simply mean this: organized society, shared symbols, sophisticated language, deep sky watching traditions, clever engineering, existed before the neat dates we like to put on timelines. And we are just one more chapter in that ongoing pattern. So what do we do with that idea? We're not Sumer. We have satellites, particle accelerators, global networks. But we're also just as vulnerable to the one thing every civilization seems to underestimate: forgetting. Not as individuals. We forget our keys. As civilizations, we forget entire worlds. The Sumerians didn't know how long their restoration would last. They just knew something had been saved for them, and they were trying not to break the chain. In a way, we're now holding that same chain. Their tablets are in our museums. Their stories are in our translations. Their numbers are in our clocks. We're the next archivists, and we have a choice. Treat their words as quaint mythology, pat them on the head, and go back to assuming history starts where our written record does. Or accept that what we've dug up might be a partial message from people who live at the edge of someone else's ending, and tried very hard to stop the next ending from erasing everything. If you're listening to this in the dark, in bed, headphones on, with your phone glowing in your hand, you are farther away from that Sumerian scribe than they were from the birth of writing itself. But through those wedges in clay, through translations and scholars and cameras and screens, you're still hearing them. Not perfectly, not clearly, but enough. Enough to feel that strange thrum under all the data. This is not the beginning. This is what we managed to save. So maybe the real point of this whole mystery isn't to prove or disprove some lost civilization. Maybe it's to ask a quieter, harder question. If some future archaeologists were to dig through the ruins of our world, if they found some tiny surviving shard of our knowledge, what would we want it to say? What would we want to hand forward? Because like the Sumerians, we're living at a hinge point. We have enormous knowledge. We have serious, escalating risks. We have no guarantee that everything we know will glide smoothly into the future. And like the Sumerians, we may not get to choose whether catastrophe ever comes. But we do get to choose how seriously we take the job of remembering, of preserving what matters, of telling the next people, whoever they are, we were here. This is what we learned. Please, don't make our mistakes. And whatever you do, don't let this all be forgotten again. If that idea pulls at you, if you like walking a thin line between history and mystery, between clay and cosmos, you know what to do. Subscribe, stick around, and let's keep listening to the oldest voices we can still hear. Because somewhere out there, under desert sand and behind museum glass, fingerprints and clay are still waiting for someone to finally say, I hear you, and I believe this was never meant to be the beginning, only the last surviving page of story that's still being written.